Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler at Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. We're going to introduce Reverend Marie Fortune in just a moment, but first I want to give you a couple of technical details. You should be able to hear me now and see the technical information screen on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. And if you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. We welcome your questions as we go through the presentation, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end to answer as many as possible. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation using the question box on the right side of your screen. I'll hold on to the questions until the presentation is over. Lastly, the slides that you see today will be emailed to you as a PDF document, so you'll have them as a resource going forward. We're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join us for the live session, so we welcome those who may be listening to the recording. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring this webinar. They are sponsoring 12 webinars this year as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative, and we invite you to go to their website, infaithfound.org, and check out all the great work that they're doing. They've sponsored dozens of webinars in the past few years, and most of those are available as recordings on our website, so please go check those out. And again, we thank them for their dedication to the cause. So today's presentation is being presented by Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She's the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. She's championed the importance of healthy boundaries, interpreting scripture and sacred texts to support the safety and well-being of not only women and children, but families and communities. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. Again, audience members, if you have any questions, you can submit them anytime using the question box. And I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Fortune.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And if you're in the Northeast, we hope you are safe and warm today. We're talking today about the importance of healthy boundaries in congregations, faith communities, and I want to give you a little background for this discussion. I think that the conversation we want to have today falls under the larger agenda of the Safe Church agenda, and I'm using that as a kind of umbrella term to talk about our current understanding now of the need for any faith community to be prepared and to be addressing issues across the board of safety and security for our members. And one part of a Safe Church agenda are the policies and practices that we implement for staff and volunteers, and particularly in relation to children and youth. Another area is the question of the use of the building and the security of the building and so forth. But today's conversation specifically is focused on our shared responsibility for healthy boundaries. So between clergy and laity, what do we need to do? How do we need to be in conversation with each other to support healthy boundaries in all of our relationships within our faith communities? So we're talking today about this one aspect of a larger Safe Church agenda. One of the ways that we have come to this conversation at this point in time is here at Faith Trust we've been training clergy around healthy boundaries for a number of years. And we felt like that was the place to begin trying to address the problem of boundary violations by clergy involved in misconduct that has caused great harm to lay people who've been the victims of that misconduct. But as we've engaged in that training with clergy over the years, one of the things we've begun to realize and begun to hear from many of you out there in your own congregations is that training clergy is only part of what's needed. The conversation has to extend beyond just the clergy to involve the laity. And I think this is a very exciting development because what it means is that there is some interest and concern to share the responsibility within a congregation. And so that's why we're having this conversation today, and we welcome your insights and questions as we proceed, because this is the beginning of an effort on our part to facilitate these kinds of conversations between clergy and lay. Part of what I think laity would find helpful is even to understand what we're teaching the clergy, so that you can understand that how that conversation goes in terms of the clergy, and what are some of the principles that we're trying to teach there. So that would be one area that could certainly use some conversation, it seems to me. But also the other aspect of this that's really important to me is that we establish an understanding of why healthy boundaries in a congregation are in everyone's interest, why all of us benefit when we work with each other to maintain a healthy environment. Now today we have half of you are clergy and half of you are laity, according to our poll. And so I'm going to be speaking basically to both groups in terms of the shared concern for healthy boundaries. Next slide. Specifically, why is this an issue for laity? To share responsibility for healthy boundaries with clergy and to take responsibilities for healthy boundaries among the laity. And I'm going to illustrate both of these concerns as we go along. I do want to be clear that the bottom line here in terms of the conduct of clergy is that clergy are responsible for our healthy boundaries in relation to laity. And it is our responsibility to not violate those boundaries. And when we do, then we need to be called to account for that. And that's a lot of the work in recent years has gone into, as I say, training clergy, but also providing the mechanisms by which, if a clergy person does engage in misconduct, that there's a mechanism for that to be reported and acted on by the judicatory. So I want to be clear, that's the starting point, but that's not enough. And that's why we need to have a fuller conversation for laity and clergy in terms of how we share responsibility and a commitment for healthy boundaries in our congregations. Next slide. The basic purpose of boundaries, I'm sure is familiar to you all. It ensures the safety and protection of those who are vulnerable due to a variety of circumstances, and that can be any of us at different points of our lives. Good boundaries build trust in relationship, and trust is very important for the health of a congregation. It ensures the appropriateness of our roles, that we understand our particular roles, especially roles of leadership, whether that be clergy or lay. And hopefully it promotes respect for others so that we have an appreciation for the particularity of our cultural history and background in relation to various kinds of boundaries that are part of our interaction as a community. And certainly healthy boundaries build a healthy community, which is what we hope for all of our faith communities to be. Next slide, please. Now, just in terms of the sort of big picture of dealing with boundaries, first of all, it's about power. And as individuals, we experience our power in relation to others in a variety of ways. And it particularly is clear or clearer to us when we're dealing with particular roles. So the teacher-student relationship, the doctor-patient relationship, the employer-employee relationship, the parent-child relationship, the faith leader or clergy, and the congregant. So think for a minute about who you are in all aspects of your life, and locate yourself in terms of these various roles. Because I think for most of us, we fall into a variety of places in terms of these roles and these settings. But particularly today, I'm going to highlight the roles of faith leader and congregant, and also the role of employer-employee. Because those of you who are laity may be an employer and have employees working for you in a work setting, but if you're a member of a congregation, you're also, to some degree, the employer of your faith leader. And that's one of the things that sets up an interesting dynamic in terms of our healthy boundaries. But certainly all of us have been in the position of student, patient, most likely employee, childhood, as well as in a leadership role where we've had responsibility for the well-being of those people. And specifically today, we'll look at faith leader and employer. Next slide, please. So in terms of how power works within these relationships, I want to use an image here that I learned about from sailing. Any of you who sail, this will be familiar to you. There's something called the rules of the sea, which is an international policy that basically says that the vessel has the greatest power is burdened. I'll explain that language in a minute. So we're talking about the speedboat, the boat that is under power, that has additional power to be able to control its movements. And because it has that power, it also has the obligation to watch out for the vessels that don't have that power. And that's why it's called a burden, the responsibility to watch out for and avoid the boats that have less power. So the sailboat, the canoe, the kayak, the small vessel that doesn't have a motor that powers it is called the privileged party, because it's the mercy of the wind and the current and can't control its movements in the same way. It can't stop or necessarily slow down, speed up in the same way that a speedboat can. And that makes it vulnerable to the power boats and the bigger boats. So the rules of the sea say that that vessel is privileged, which means that under normal circumstances, it can expect that the speedboats, the power boats, will watch out for it and not run into it and not cause it any harm. It's sort of like also being a pedestrian vis-a-vis the person driving a car. The pedestrian, in a lot of places, not everywhere I must admit, but in a lot of places the expectation and the law is clearly that the pedestrian has the right-of-way and the person driving the car is responsible for avoiding doing any harm to that person. So it's that same concept. And so, next slide. In terms of how we understand power and vulnerability in our relationships, power is what comes with having greater resources in a particular setting, in a particular relationship. And with that comes the responsibility to use that power carefully. Vulnerability is this experience of simply having fewer resources in that moment, in that relationship. And unfortunately, that vulnerability means that we have the potential in that setting to be violated or exploited. And we could give a number of examples for this on each side of this equation. but I want you to focus on your experiences of when you've been in a position of leadership and had some degree of resources that meant you were responsible to use that resource carefully in relation to other people, and then to think about situations where you experience vulnerability, such as being a patient in surgery, for example, where clearly your doctor is the one that has the resources and you are vulnerable to that person, and hopefully that person is responsible and taking care of you. Next slide. So that's basically a short discussion of the notion of power and vulnerability in our relationships. But we want to put that together with looking at the nature of boundaries themselves. And oftentimes when I've had this conversation with both clergy and lay, at some point somebody comes up with a concern or an anxiety that, well, we don't want to build walls between us. We don't want to wall off our clergy person or, artificial barriers and so forth and so on, which is absolutely right. Next slide. So a wall is, by definition, something that is built to keep somebody in and somebody out, to establish a barrier that is impenetrable. And those of us who can recall the Berlin Wall and how it functioned in that way, to separate families, to divide a nation, to divide groups of people, and the damage that that caused. But it functioned the way it was supposed to. It was intended to separate and prevent any connection between people. But that's only one kind of boundary. Next slide. The fence is another kind of boundary. And probably all of us have had experiences with various kinds of fences in our yards or playgrounds or whatever settings we live in, that there are fences. The thing about a fence is that it clearly marks a line, but it's also permeable. You can stand on either side of a fence and have a conversation. There's usually a gate in the fence so that people can come and go through the gate. It's intended to mark a line and be clear about where that line is, but it's not intended to wall off or prevent communication or relationship between people. And that's the kind of boundary that we're talking about when we talk about healthy boundaries in congregations. Next slide. So very briefly, I want to remind you of Robert Frost's discussion of fences and walls in his poem, The Mending Wall. And as a New Englander, Frost sets his poem in his home where he tells the story of the rock wall in the field between his property and his neighbor's property. And it's a wall something like this one in the picture. Because in New England, all the walls in the fields were built by just piling up rocks that were taken out of the field before they could be plowed. And so in the wintertime, the weather damages those walls and forces the rocks to fall out and kind of messes it up. So what happens in the spring is that the owners of each side of the property, in this case Frost and his neighbor, walk that wall and replace the rocks that have fallen away and generally repair it and maintain it. And his poem, Mending Wall, is a conversation that he's having with himself, but also with his neighbor about this whole notion of this wall. And if you recall, he begins the poem with something there is that doesn't love a wall. and he's talking about his ambivalence about why do we even need to have this wall. We're not trying to keep cows on your side or sheep on my side or anything like that. What's the point of this? And so he has this dialogue as he walks along, and they repair the wall together. And his neighbor throughout simply says, "Good fences make good neighbors." And that's what Frost is debating with himself, is how is that? Why does that work that way? Is that in fact the case? But basically in the poem what we're getting is an expression of the ambivalence we probably all feel at some point about why do we need this thing here when clearly if we simply want to cross it we just step over it. What is the point of having a wall, a boundary? And yet, in the poem, Frost is able to affirm the value of maintaining the wall with the neighbor and walking the boundary together at least once a year in the spring, and the value of having that wall there as part of their relationship. So let's go to the next slide, because in the Christian tradition, we also have some help from our sacred text, specifically in terms of understanding the importance of the boundaries that we have among us and how they function to support us and to build up our relationships. Because we have in the Gospels the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And in John's Gospel specifically, he talks about he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door but climbs in by another way is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow them, for they know his voice. A stranger will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. So basically in this passage, and describing the Good Shepherd, he's talking about the person who has the responsibility for leading the sheep, and he's describing that relationship as one of trust, that the sheep will not follow a stranger because they don't know the voice, but they do know the voice of their own shepherd and trust that the shepherd is acting in their best interest. Now, contrasted with that image of the Good Shepherd is the image in Ezekiel 34 in the Hebrew text of the false shepherd. And here we have a lengthy description of shepherds who were mistreating their flocks and not taking care of them and using the flock for their own needs, and instead of caring for the flock as they had been hired to do by the owner. And so Ezekiel is basically using this metaphor to talk about the community leaders, both religious and secular, and the concern for the violations and exploitations of the sheep by the false shepherds. And finally, Ezekiel concludes, this is the response from God: I am against the shepherds. I will require the sheep at their hand and put a stop to their feeding them. No longer shall the shepherds feed themselves. I will rescue my sheep from their mouths, that they may not be food for them. I will feed them with justice. So Ezekiel's using the false shepherd image to call out the leaders of his community for their corruption and exploitation of vulnerable people. So we have those two contrasting images of the shepherd as the leader in relation to the sheep who are more vulnerable in their situation. But I also want to lift up one distinction that we need to make about boundary crossing and boundary violation. because again, sometimes we get confused about the difference, and we tend to want to look at these things as all of one or nothing. So there's a lot of gray area in the middle. There's a lot of nuance in dealing with boundaries that we have to be able to incorporate in our understanding. And such as the notion of boundary crossing and boundary violation. Boundary crossing simply means anything we do that simply crosses a boundary. So you call somebody up on the phone, you're crossing a boundary. You write them a letter, you're crossing a boundary. You show up to visit them, you're crossing a boundary. And that in and of itself is not a problem as long as it's not hurtful and harmful to the other person. But when the boundary crossing becomes harmful and exploitative, then it becomes a violation of someone's boundaries. And that's when we have a problem, and that's when we have to act to deal with it. But basically, again, for those of us in the Christian tradition, we have the stories from Jesus' life where he was crossing boundaries all the time. It was sort of, frankly, the centerpiece of his ministry. He was crossing boundaries that needed to be crossed, that were not in the best interest of the people, not building a healthy community, but boundaries that were, in fact, harmful. And he challenged those boundaries and crossed those boundaries. So we had that image of what ministry looks like in terms of the importance of being able to stretch and cross boundaries. But we never see Jesus violating another person. So the distinction between crossing and violating is a very important one in terms of how we understand our experience of boundaries in a congregation. So let's continue with the next slide. I think what we need at this point is an ongoing conversation between clergy and laity. And these are just some of the questions that I think would be helpful to that conversation. And for those of you listening today who are lay leaders, just think about these questions and how a conversation like this might go in your congregation. What are your expectations of your faith leaders? For example, in terms of time, do you expect your faith leader to be accessible to you 24/7 in a non-emergency situation? So do you expect that you can call up your faith leader virtually any hour of the day or night just to ask a question or check and see when a meeting is or have a good idea or something? Emergencies obviously are a different thing, but in terms of the day-to-day activities of a congregation, do you understand that your clergy person needs to have privacy and downtime in order to be healthy, basically? And how do you, as laity, respect that and support that? Do you understand when your faith leader says no? And I mean that in terms of says no to an invitation from you for an activity or for a relationship, no to a gift that your faith leader might feel is not appropriate in some way or could somehow compromise your relationship. Do you understand that no is setting a boundary in your best interest? And so it's not personal in terms of denying you or something directed at you. It's simply being clear about what the boundaries are and what your faith leader is comfortable with in terms of setting those boundaries. So, let's talk about that. Let's talk about examples of that you may have experienced. And then what about dual relationships? Dual relationships are the relationships, situations with one person where each of us may be in two different roles depending on the circumstance of our relationship. So, for example, let's say you are a garage mechanic in your town, and your faith leader on Sundays and whenever you interact as a congregant is your pastor, your faith leader. But when he or she brings their car in to be repaired, then you are the repair person that they need. You're the person with resources to take care of their situation that they come to. So now you're in a different role, and you're really in a dual relationship, which is not a problem as long as people recognize that that's what it is. I remember my mother talking about when she was an elementary school teacher, and I attended the school where she taught, and she was real clear from the beginning that I would certainly never be in her class, but she was also real clear with the principal that someday she would go into the principal's office to speak with him as a parent to deal with something about me, but other times she would go into the principal's office as a teacher, a staff member, to deal with something totally different. And he and she had talked about that, and so they were clear about the difference and the dual roles and dual relationships that they were in. And so they managed it very well. But the management of it grew mostly from recognizing that there were two different kinds of relationships going on here. So let's talk about those dual relationships that we have in congregations, particularly I think in small communities where in terms of business and services in the community, we are most likely to be in those situations with a congregant. And then what about your faith leaders' boundaries themselves? So touch boundaries. Some faith leaders are very affectionate and physically available and warm and huggers, let's say. Others are not. And so what's the level of comfort of your faith leader in terms of that physical touch interaction? And certainly sexual boundaries. We could spend a great deal of the session just talking about the experiences of some clergy of being sexually harassed by congregants, having their sexual boundaries violated. So what about those boundaries? Do you recognize those boundaries for your faith leader and help to maintain them and support them? Next slide, please. So a couple of things to be aware of in terms of taking responsibility for boundaries in a healthy setting is that the church, congregation, the setting of your faith community is a workplace as well as a community. And as a workplace, it employs staff, clergy and others who are employees. And so if you're a lay leader in that setting, you are in the position of employer. You have a responsibility to your employees, and you also have power in relation to your employees. And yet, in relation to your faith leader, that relationship can be reversed, obviously, when you're in the hospital and your faith leader is coming to visit you and be with you through that experience. Then they're clearly your pastor, your faith leader, and in a different role altogether. So that in and of itself is a dual relationship for anyone who's a leader in the faith community. But the church is also a community itself, the organization, the experience of fellowship and community. And many lay people have leadership roles in a faith community and experiences in the faith community with other lay people. So, for example, the passing of the peace, which is a common experience in a lot of worshiping communities at some point during the service. Passing of the peace is stopping and inviting people to greet their neighbors. And people do that in a variety of different ways, and there's usually kind of a cultural norm that operates within a particular congregation. Some people are hug and kiss. Some people shake hands. Some people simply acknowledge with a word to their neighbor and so forth. But the passing of the peace is one of those places where boundaries come into play and where people's comfort levels may be different. I've talked with some people who, because of their experiences of abuse earlier in their lives, have a great deal of difficulty going into a faith community setting where passing of the peace is going to mean getting a hug from a stranger. That's not something they're going to be comfortable with. And literally it means for some people they don't participate in a faith community because of that expectation. So it's, again, having a conversation about these aspects of our life together and what are the norms and expectations that we want to establish in how we are with each other in community in terms of boundaries. Next slide, please. Healthy boundaries are also a topic in the secular world, and those of you who work in settings where you've probably been exposed to the way in which the secular world discusses these things. The equal employment opportunity laws are laws in the workplace that protect against discrimination and harassment. And so you may have received training in those settings about harassment and good boundaries in the workplace. And in the corporate workplace as well, those boundaries are established in order to protect those relationships between employer and employee, among employees, and ensure hopefully a healthy work environment where people can get their work done and protect from potential litigation and problems of misconduct in that setting. So that's an aspect. Again, the workplace aspect is also part of our conversation in our faith communities and an area that we need to provide for in terms of policy and practice. Next slide. You may be surprised to learn that the workplace issues are significant for clergy. Several studies with female clergy have found 60% of female clergy have experienced sexual harassment at some point in our ministries from either parishioners or other clergy. This is a problem that's also reported by male clergy, it's just not as frequent. And I mean sexual harassment in the classic sense of someone seeking to take advantage of the clergy person because they have the power to do so in terms of the congregation. So a powerful lay leader, let's say a young, newly ordained clergy person comes in, and the lay leader basically puts the moves on this person because they're in a position to do so because they have more power in the congregation than the clergy person does in that immediate instance. So that's the circumstance of a lot of sexual harassment that we hear about. And then also 50% of lay women have reported being sexually harassed by other lay people in the church. So the boundary issues are there in terms of clergy to laity and laity to clergy, but also the boundary issues are there among laity, and inappropriate and harmful, exploitative violations of boundaries from one lay person to another lay person. So next slide. I expect those of you who are on this webinar are aware of what happens when we don't attend to these issues. We end up with a culture allowing the exploitation of those who are vulnerable, turning a blind eye to it, and it only serves to destroy, really, the trust and the core of a faith community. It breeds mistrust and secrecy, and ultimately not dealing with it then affects people's faith and runs counter to the foundational principles of who we say we are as people of faith. So the consequences are enormous, and I expect that most of you on the webinar today are aware of that, which is why it's so important that we not only continue to train clergy about our boundaries, but also that we expand this conversation to include laity and share that responsibility. Next slide. So for those of you who are laity, again, and just beginning this conversation together, I would invite you to contemplate the recognition of your role in your community. So what are the responsibilities that you have as a lay leader? What is the power that you have in that role? The responsibility you've been given as chair of the board of trustees, or chair of the Sunday school committee that provides religious education for our children and youth, chair of the personnel committee. These are all very important roles in your congregation, and in that role you have a particular responsibility, and boundaries as part of that responsibility. So the appropriate use of the power of those roles is fundamental to healthy boundaries. And again, I think all I'm suggesting is how important it is that we have a conversation about these various aspects of who we are in fellowship together in a faith community. Next slide. So finally, to build healthy communities, we have the responsibility to hold ourselves, our clergy, and congregants responsible for appropriate faithful relationships. And we do that, I think, by sharing this conversation as an ongoing conversation as to how we do that and how we understand that between and among us. Supporting victims of harassment who do come forward and share their experience within our faith community context. And certainly creating opportunities for training and education and conversation about healthy boundaries. And there are many, many settings in our faith communities where we can do that with adults, with children, with youth, and so forth. But the bottom line for this discussion is that we address these concerns and engage in dialogue about these issues, not in crisis, but before we ever face a crisis. And I really believe it's fundamentally prevention work that helps us avoid boundary violations and the crises that come with those. But it's very hard to motivate, I think, people to take the time to have these conversations when they're not in crisis. And I think that's one of the challenges of the dialogue between laity and clergy, is what does it take for us to sit down and engage around these issues as a preventive measure, not because we're now in crisis and there have been boundary violations that we have to deal with. So that's, I think, the challenge for all of us, is how do we find ways to do that? How do we help each other do that work when we're in normal times, not in crisis times, and integrate the conversation in the way we do Sunday school, the way we do youth work, the way we do personnel work, the way we do worship, the way we do everything we do in a faith community. So that's the challenge that I think faces all of us as we address these issues. So I'd like to take your questions or concerns at this point. And the resource list, you'll get the resource list. The one thing I want to highlight for you is Scott Edelstein's book, which is number 4 on this list, Sex and the Spiritual Teacher. The reason I want to particularly recommend that to you is that Scott is a layperson. He is also a Buddhist, and he's speaking within a Buddhist context, but beyond that to all of us in our various faith communities. But his voice is the voice of a layperson, and so I have found his discussion particularly valuable in this whole arena of engaging laity in a conversation about healthy boundaries. So I really recommend his book to you. It's available here at Faith Trust if you're interested. So what concerns would you like to address?
Thank you, Marie. So again, audience members, if you have any questions, you can type them into the question box on the right side of your screen, and I will offer those up to Marie. So I have one question here, which is about negotiating cultural differences between ideas of appropriate boundaries. You mentioned passing the peace. This question is specifically about perhaps cultural differences within a faith community.
Yeah, very important concern, particularly as we have the opportunity to live more and more in multicultural environments where we each bring our particular cultural background and expectations to the relationships in a community setting. Again, I think the important thing is the conversation, so that let's use touch boundaries as the example. So when I was in South Korea doing training there with the Catholic diocese around domestic violence, one of the things I learned very quickly was that the proper greeting in the Korean context was simply to bow and not to offer a hand for shaking hands. Shaking hands is a very Western form of greeting, and in other areas in Asia that's true as well, that the just bowing respectfully from the waist is the proper greeting to meeting someone. So, you know, if we put that in the context of our faith communities, then how we greet each other, and if we do have the passing of the peace, then it's going to depend on our background, our experience, and our comfort level, what makes sense to us, what is appropriate, what's respectful in our experience. And we've got to negotiate that. We've got to appreciate that we bring differences to that, and be willing to limit our the shape of our boundary crossing so that the other person is comfortable. As far as I'm concerned, that's the standard. So I was curious about this several months ago in my own church where I attend, and sitting in the pew, and time came for the passing of the peace, and mostly the people that sit around me I know and have some connection to. But I turned around to greet whoever was behind me, and there was a man I'd never seen before, and I held out my hand to him, and he immediately reached for me with both arms and said, "Oh no, this needs to be a hug." And I put my hand out and said, "No, I don't think so. I'm very happy with a handshake." And he was quite taken aback by that, I could tell. And that was just my boundary. That was, I'm not comfortable being hugged by a stranger. I'm perfectly comfortable shaking hands and greeting and meeting someone for the first time. But he was taken aback. So it had not occurred to him that I think that his particular way, which I think was genuine, of engaging in passing the peace was not necessarily appropriate for everyone else around him. So, but we have to have that conversation. We have to be able to engage with each other about those differences in order to establish you know, what's comfortable for you, what's comfortable for me, what's comfortable for us as a group.
Okay, I have another question for you. In terms of allowing new people to enter into leadership roles within the faith community, lay leaders, what do you suggest is the way to go about, let's say, training for boundaries, training for appropriate expectations?
Well, that's really the question that we're working on here at Faith Trust in terms of how we can help encourage and support this conversation that I keep talking about. And I think what we're going to come up with is a short curriculum package that will provide a mechanism for, let's say, a parish council, a group of lay leaders, to sit down and spend an hour having this conversation, but that we can give some guidance to it in terms of using some video material and some questions, guided questions for discussion. But I think it's also something that clergy can do, clergy who go through boundary training, which most of us do every 2 or 3 or 4 years. That's a conversation we can take back with us to our laity. We can preach about these issues as a way of engaging and beginning a conversation. So I think there are a variety of possibilities, but it is something that here at Faith Trust we hope to develop so that we can give you some tools to initiate these conversations with a congregation.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and it's about basically how boundaries seem to be so much more permeable now because we have so many ways to interact with people, especially online or phones or social media. And is there a difference between the laws or the ideas behind what's appropriate in person, what's appropriate online? How do you make those distinctions?
Well, that's a very important area for discussion, and again, it should be part of, in terms of that Safe Church agenda I talked about at the beginning, that big umbrella. Social media, use of social media should be part of the policy and practices for the congregation as a whole in terms of how people use the website, how people are communicating via Facebook and so forth. But basically, my concern about this has been that as this technology has come into our lives, a lot of folks were very excited by the possibilities of this kind of communication, but didn't stop and think about the implications, particularly around boundaries, and particularly in the faith community setting between clergy and laity. And so I think have kind of crossed boundaries in ways that have become violations, sometimes inadvertently, because they didn't stop and think. And so that's where the conversation needs to go, so that we begin to establish some norms for how we communicate in our particular faith community using social media. Again, it's a question of access to your faith leader. Do you assume that you have Facebook access to your faith leader? A pastor told me a story about a woman who came up to him in church who was very upset with him and said, "Why didn't you come visit me?" And he said, "Well, Mrs. Jones, I'm sorry. What's happened? I didn't know there was a concern that I need to come visit you. Please tell me what's going on." And she said, "Well, my granddaughter was killed in a car wreck last week, and you didn't come visit me." And he was obviously shaken by this. And he said, I didn't know that that's what had happened. I'm so sorry. If I had known, I would certainly have come." And she said, "Well, it was on my Facebook page." So her expectation was that her pastor was monitoring her Facebook page. And so whatever crisis she experienced and posted on her Facebook page, that he would have been aware of it and should have responded to it. So that's an example to me of we've got to have a conversation about our expectations around social media and the potential pitfalls of social media, the things we need to watch out for and be careful about, particularly around children and youth. But again, that we do that together so that we have a shared understanding of how we use this resource in the faith community, what its limits are, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and that it doesn't, instead of being a facilitator of communication, become an impediment to our relationships because we're not being careful and thoughtful about how we use it. But that's a great conversation for the leadership of a congregation to have, and specifically around social media, developing a policy for the congregation of how the congregation will use social media in its ministry. And we have resources to help do that. If you're particularly interested in that, get back to us on that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Marie. So that's the last of the questions. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Just thank you for being with us today in this effort, and I hope it has encouraged you to initiate these conversations in your setting. And if you have already done so or are planning to do so, let us know what your experience is. Because as I say, we're at a stage here at Faith Trust of developing some tools to help enable these conversations between clergy and laity. And we would be happy to incorporate your experience if you can let us know how it goes for you. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Marie, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And also thanks to In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. We're going to end in just a second, and as you close the webinar window, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey. So if you would just take a moment to complete it, give us your feedback, any suggestions you have, we would really appreciate it. Also, we have several more upcoming webinars, and I'll send you that information when I send the PDF file this afternoon. I want to thank you for joining us, and this concludes today's presentation. Thank you. Have a good day.